Welcome to the Naturally Healthy Pets podcast. Let's get to it. Hello and welcome to the Naturally Healthy Pets podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Judy Morgan. My guest today is someone who has a lot of brain cells that work really, really, really well because he's done some really smart things. And what we are going to talk about today is the epigenetic paw print, understanding dog behavior and aging. And this is actually being done through DNA testing, and it's pretty cool. So my guest today is Dr. Matteo Pellegrini. He's a biophysicist who has served on the UCLA Life Sciences Division faculty since he joined the Department of Molecular, Cell, and Developmental Biology in 2005. He earned his bachelor's in physics at Columbia University and his PhD in physics at Stanford. See, I told you he's really smart. He was a postdoctoral fellow at UCLA where he worked on computational biology. His laboratory research centers on the development of novel computational approaches to analyze large-scale genomic and epigenomic data. This is cool. Like, how does your brain works in a totally different way than mine? Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So what got you started down this road?
Yeah, my career has been kind of all over the place, but I started becoming interested in genetics and epigenetics when I became faculty at UCLA about 20 years ago. And it was the time when DNA sequencing became more rapid. So, one of the rate limiting steps for doing this kind of research is the ability to gather, DNA sequence data. And it used to be very expensive and time consuming. But over the past 20 years, there's been a real revolution, right? The instrumentation we use to gather DNA sequence data has just become dramatically more efficient, just like many other types of technologies in our life. And so now it's become just very routine to collect DNA sequence data, and it's very inexpensive. And so that's opened up, avenues of research as well as direct to consumer testing, all these things.
It's very cool. So, and the thing is, you collect all this data and then knowing how to interpret it and what it means. And I guess that's where you come in, and you've done a lot of research to figure all that out. Can you, what is the difference between epigenetics and genetics? So genetics is our DNA, it's what we're made up of, but what is epigenetics and how does that play in?
Yeah, so basically, every cell in our body has the same DNA sequence. It has essentially a blueprint for, how to make the cells work. But obviously, our cells are different, right? If you look at your cells in your skin or your cells in your blood or the cells in your brain, they're dramatically different, right? So how do we explain the fact that cells that have the same DNA within them have very different traits, very different shapes, very different properties? And that's where epigenetics comes in. So epigenetics basically is the science of understanding how the DNA is interpreted by different cells. And there are, many molecular mechanisms that cells use to interpret the DNA. A way to think about it is imagine, your DNA is an encyclopedia, right? So we have many, many words in our encyclopedia, but not everybody reads the same section of the encyclopedia, right? Some people may specialize in one type and some people may specialize in other sections. And so our cells are the same way, right? And so some cells are reading certain parts of DNA and other parts are reading others. And so epigenetics tells us, which parts of the DNA are going to be read by different types of cells.
So cool. So one of the things that I did go to your website, which by the way is ProsperK9, K and the number 9.com for DNA testing kits. And we can talk about that some more. But one of the things that was talked about on there is you use DNA methylation in some of your testing. What is that? And what are we looking at when we look at it?
Yeah. So back to the notion that DNA is being read differently in every cells. One aspect of that is the DNA is actually directly modified. And so that we think of DNA as having, 4 letters, A, C, G, and T. But in fact, DNA has 5 letters because the C can be found in 2 different states, the C and the methyl C. So that's what DNA methylation refers to, is the methylation of one of the bases. And this, whether the base is methylated or not, gets back to whether the DNA is being read and genes are being produced at that particular location. So by knowing the pattern of DNA methylation, we can essentially get a profile of which genes are active in the cell and which genes are inactive. So it's telling us something about what type of cell that's going to be based on these DNA methylation patterns.
And what affects the methylation? Like what would make you see more or less of that?
Yeah, so there's many factors that affect DNA methylation. So one is the type of cell. So for instance, a neural cell may be expressing certain genes that are only found in the brain, or a skin cell would be expressing genes that are found in the skin, like keratin or something like that. So every cell is expressing different genes, and this is reflected in the DNA methylation patterns. There's also differences in DNA methylation patterns between men and women. So, for instance, we have sex chromosomes. Women have 2 X chromosomes, men have 1. The methylation of those chromosomes is different between men and women. And so it's reflective of that. It's also reflective of age. And that's where my company is particularly interested in it. About 10 years ago, we discovered that the methylation patterns of DNA change as people get older. And so you can measure these methylation patterns and infer the age of an individual based on these patterns.
So if I sent a DNA test of my dog into your company, based on the amount of methylation, you'd be able to tell me, because I have one dog, he was found as a stray. So you would be able to give me an idea of the age of my dog?
Exactly, right. So what we've done is we've collected, DNA samples from dogs of different ages, from puppies all the way to, older dogs, 15, 16 years old. And we find that there are certain methylation sites that, track these ages very well. And so we use, computational methods, artificial intelligence type approaches to then take these patterns of DNA methylation and essentially predict the age of the dog. And we can do that reasonably accurately. So we can typically predict the age of the dog within a year. And so it's the most accurate method available to date to measure the age of a dog. I mean, veterinarians look at teeth and there's other, sort of proxies, but they're not terribly accurate.
The teeth method does not work very well for dogs, I will say.
So this is sort of a DNA molecular-based method that can give you that 1-year accuracy. And so far, it's the most accurate method out there for estimating the age of a dog. And of course, it's not limited to dogs. You can use the same approach to estimate the age of a human or any other kind of animal that you have access to.
Oh, cool. So is your lab only doing testing on dogs, or could the same information be used, for instance, for cats?
Absolutely, yeah. So we, in my lab at UCLA, we study many, many different animals. So we do humans, mice, dogs. We've done frogs, fish, all kinds of things. So we really span the kind of Noah's Ark type of research across animals. We have not yet done cats, but other labs have done cats. So there's, we're not the only lab doing these things. So there are these big consortia that are applying these techniques to all kinds of species, including cats. So there are now even commercial tests available for cats for estimating the age of cats, as well as dogs and other animals as well.
Very cool. And so what kind of sample does someone have to send in order to get this? I mean, are we going to have to take our dog to the veterinarian and get a blood sample to send to you, or hair samples? How are we getting that DNA?
No, usually we the simplest way is these buccal swabs. So you just take a little, a swab, like a Q-tip, and you swab the inside of the dog's mouth, and it collects some of the cheek cells as well as some saliva cells. And then you ship that back in, and we can extract DNA from that. So that's a much easier way to collect data.
That's cool.
Than blood.
Yeah, no kidding. So, so there are other tests where we're testing for like allergies and things where we have to get like a aliquot full of saliva. But with this, we don't have to have like a ton of saliva. It's really just getting some of those cells and a little bit of saliva on
Exactly.
there.
Yeah. So it's just a
Oh, how
little
simple is that?
swab, like a little Q-tip. You rub the inside of your dog's mouth for like, 30 seconds. And usually that gives you enough material to be able to extract DNA and do these tests.
That is so cool. So what are there other things that can be tested besides just, I mean, for instance, most of my dogs, I know their age, but this one, I have no clue. So are there other things that we can test? Like if I send in a sample, other than finding out how old he is, are there other things that we can test from this cheek sample?
Yeah. So well, obviously there's two types of tests. There's the standard, genetic tests that can tell you about the breed. They can tell you about whether the dog has genetic variants that predispose them to certain diseases. It can also tell you something about inbreeding, and so there's many tests on the market that can provide this to consumers. On the epigenetic side, apart from the age, we also showed that there's associations between the DNA methylation and behaviors. So we collected, behavioral data from dogs, and we showed that, based on the methylation patterns, there's a strong correlation with certain behaviors like aggressive behaviors or how energetic the dog is. We've also seen that there are differences between dogs that are spayed or dogs that are intact. So there's effects from those kind of surgical interventions. And we're constantly looking for other types of effects. So in other species, there's like, for instance, in humans, you can see effects from smoking and diet and things like that. So we don't have that kind of data in dogs yet, but we think as the research continues, we'll understand other environmental factors that can affect DNA methylation, and so you'll be able to read that out from these tests as well.
So that brings an interesting question to mind. So let's say if we're sending in and we're looking at the methylation for age, if that dog came from a household where there were a lot of environmental pollutants, smoke, whatever, environmental pollutants, would that increase the methylation and kind of muddy the waters for determining the age? If they had a really poor diet or they lived in a really polluted environment, would that affect what you're going to use to get an age on that dog?
Usually these signals are separate, or in science we say they're orthogonal. So the effects on age are completely separate of the effects from like pollutants and things like that. So usually it doesn't affect the age estimates. So I'll just give you one example. Again, we don't have examples from dogs yet, but in humans, there's one gene that is differentially methylated depending on whether you smoke or not. So, for instance, smokers will have certain methylation at these genes, and others, non-smokers, will have. So we hope to find other things like that in dogs. Another example is we're working with the ASPCA. They obviously collect dogs that have had kind of traumatic early lives and have been stressed early in life. And so we're trying to collect samples from those dogs to compare it to dogs that have instead have been in nurturing environments, so we can find DNA methylation differences and see signatures of kind of stressful
Very cool.
Initial life stages. And there's, again, lots of scientific research that's been done to show that this kind of early stage of not just human, any kind of animal nurturing affects the epigenome as well. So it could be used potentially as an indication that some certain dogs have had difficult beginnings.
That is so cool. We need to take a break to hear from our sponsors. We'll be right back, and we're going to continue this discussion, which is fascinating. Stay tuned.
Are you looking for the ultimate one-stop resource for canine hospice and palliative care? Then you need to check out our recent course, An Integrative Approach to Hospice and Palliative Care for Dogs. There are 3 versions to this course that also include live meetings and a certification option. These informative courses are led by Dr. Judy Morgan and Michelle Allen, 2 experts in dog hospice. Dr. Judy covers the integrative veterinary medicine aspect of hospice, and Michelle tackles the real-life experiences and care expertise. The combination of these two skill sets has created the best online course for knowledge on dog hospice. As a thank you to our podcast listeners, use code PODCAST45 for 20% off any of these hospice-related courses found only on drjudyu.com. Do you have a senior dog in your family? Why not help to support their physical and mental well-being by giving them 100% natural Dr. Judy's Senior Formula, recommended for all breeds to support healthy joints, cognitive function, cardiovascular health, and it helps to reduce the negative effects of stress. For optimum health, order yours today on drjudymorgan.com and save 10% off with code PODCAST45.
Welcome back. You're listening to the Naturally Healthy Pets podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Judy Morgan, and my guest today, Dr. Pellegrini, is explaining the epigenetic paw print. And this is just fascinating information. And for those of us who do a lot of rescue work with our animals, and so we don't know their background, being able to do a DNA test and be able to see changes in the genome that would indicate that they had a really traumatic beginning to their life or a really rough start. It just really fascinates me. So one of my big things that I am a proponent of is fresh feeding for our pets, feeding them whole foods, real foods, not highly processed foods. Kind of the same that we talk about with people. If you really want to be healthy, you should be on a nice fresh food diet and not always be eating Doritos and corn chips. So do you know if any research has been done or anything to look at the effects of diet on the epigenome? Would that affect your methylation? I would think that some like serious malnutrition might have an effect, but do you think there'd be a difference just in eating a wholesome diet versus a highly processed diet? Has that been looked at in people?
Yes, exactly. It has been looked at in people, not so much in dogs yet, but in people, we do see that there's an epigenetic effect from your diet. And specifically, we did a study, with people with so what we would call healthy and unhealthy diets, and we saw there was an epigenetic signature. And interestingly, the factor that seemed to be strongly associated with the epigenetic signature was like meat consumption or red meat consumption. So these kind of diets do seem to impact the epigenome. The other thing I want to say is, the diets also have a dramatic impact on the microbiome, right? So as you probably know, all the bacteria in our guts and in our mouth are strongly affected by diet. And when we collect DNA from the buccal swabs, or if we collect DNA from the stool, then we can also measure the microbiome as well. And in fact, when we routinely collect DNA from the buccal swabs, we're also measuring the bacteria. And we find that the bacteria in the mouth of the dog also change as they age. Puppies tend to have certain types of healthy bacteria. And then as dogs age, they tend to accumulate what we would refer to as unhealthy bacteria that are associated with like tooth decay and gingivitis. And so, I think that the diet is probably going to have a very strong impact on the type of bacteria we find in the dog's mouth as well as in the gut. But right now we're focusing more on the mouse.
That is so cool. I mean, we talk about microbiome all the time. A lot of times we're just focused on the gut, but definitely, in our lungs, on our skin, in our mouth. And I think that a lot of the dental disease that we see in our pets is just crazy, over the top, bad. And it's one of those things that gets ignored way too often. So there's some really great products on the market now for helping modulate that microbiome in the mouth, and it's pretty critically important. So it's very cool that you actually can see that on DNA testing as well. So tell us more about ProsperK9. I went to the website and I saw that there are a few different test kits that are testing for different things. So can you tell us about some of those different tests and what you're looking at and what kind of information that gives people? Because it looked really cool.
Yeah, there's essentially three types of tests that we provide. The first is what I would refer to as the more standard test, where we look at the DNA and we compare it to dogs of different breeds. so that then we can infer, the type of breed that your dog, or breed composition of your dog. And then we have a vast database of genetic variation that's associated with traits and disease. So we can, see if your dog has certain genetic predispositions based on that. And lastly, we look at inbreeding. We know that inbreeding is a big issue with dogs, especially purebred dogs. And so we try to estimate how inbred the particular dog is based on their DNA. So that's one test. The other one is this oral microbiome test. So again, when we collect DNA from the mouth, some fraction of that DNA is coming from the bacteria instead of the dog. And so we can analyze that, compare it to bacteria, and identify which bacteria are present in the mouth and at what relative abundance. And as I mentioned, there are clear trends in bacteria being associated with sort of tooth decay and gingivitis, and this happens to increase in older dogs compared to puppies. Mm-hmm. So we can report on the types of bacteria that are found in your particular sample. And the third is the DNA methylation test, which primarily informs on age. But as I mentioned, it can also say something about the likely behavioral tendencies of your dog, or whether they might be more fearful and aggressive, or also whether they might be more energetic or sort of calmer dog.
This is so cool. It would be really nice. Let's say I wanted to go to the shelter and adopt a dog. It would be so cool to run this test before I adopted the dog, and it would tell me what the behavioral traits are so that I could say I can deal with that or I could not deal with that. I've seen so many clients that they go adopt a dog that seems, sweet and wonderful, and they get them home and discover that they have just come home with something that wants to kill everyone, or doesn't get along with anybody else. And it unfortunately can be very difficult. So when we see that, and this is probably not your wheelhouse, but so let's say I did that test and it said that my dog had fearful or aggressive tendencies based on the genome or the epigenetics. Is that something that, is that helpful to me that I can then say, okay, I'm going to have to be very careful with this, or I can do training to fix this?
Yeah, so that's one of the big differences between epigenetics and genetics, right? So genetics is fixed, right? You can't change your genetics. At least we don't have technology to do that, effectively right now. But the epigenome instead changes, and that's why we can measure aging. But also, it tells you something about behavioral tendencies, but that doesn't mean that they're fixed, right? Because it's epigenetics, in a different environment, the dog's behavior, dog's temperament can change, right? If they go from a shelter to a loving home, I'm sure that the dog will behave differently over time. So it's basically giving you some insights into their likely predisposition or the type of behaviors they tended to have in the past. But of course, this is changeable if you change their training and their environment. So, right now it gives you sort of a little bit of additional insight into your dog, and maybe changes a little bit your perspective on how to train and what kind of environment to create.
See, that could be so helpful. I think it could be helpful for so many people, and it might keep a lot of dogs out of trouble. By knowing a little bit more about their past. It doesn't tell us everything about their past, but a little bit about what might have gone on and things to avoid, things to do. So it amazes me that we can do a cheek swab and then know how to deal with our dog's personality.
Yeah, and hopefully we're just at the beginning of this, revolution, and in the next decade, these type of tests will become much, much more informative and more accessible as well, right? As the technology for gathering the data becomes less expensive and more accessible, hopefully, we'll have more tools to interact with our dog. We'll just know much more about
So it. Cool. Now, I did see on the website, there were a whole bunch of diseases listed. So when you're looking at that, at the genetic testing, are you able to tell people he's got the genes for this particular disease, or, you should watch for this or test for this? Does Does it give us that disease information?
Yes, so there are public databases, and also we can collect information from the scientific literature. So right now we have a database of about 400 genetic variations that have been associated with traits and diseases. So if your dog has a particular variant that predisposes them to the disease, that might be something, for you to track. It doesn't mean they'll get the disease. It doesn't mean they have the trait. It just means they have a genetic predisposition for that. So certainly, if you are positive for one of these disease variants, it's certainly good to, chat with the veterinarian and check if there's ways to monitor, make sure they don't develop the disease. But it's again, this type of information is also growing, but the current set of 400 is quite extensive already, so it can provide insight.
No kidding.
Most dogs will not have these variants, or will have very few, right? So a typical dog may have maybe from 0 to 1 or 2 of these variants.
I would think that could also be really helpful for breeders to be able to say, look, I tested the parents and they're negative for all these different traits. I would think that would be, I did have one breeder in my practice who did genetic testing on her dogs that she was breeding. And it was really cool that she could bring in a report that says, look, we're negative for all these things. And I would think if you're going out to purchase a dog, that would be great information. But even if you adopt a dog and you don't know anything about their history or even what their breed is, so you don't know what they might be predisposed to, based on breeding, this could be really cool information that could be useful for both, the owner and the veterinarian to have that information of what to watch for.
Yeah,
so
I think
this
more
is
and more
very
breeders
cool.
are using this kind of data.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
It makes perfect sense for them to do that. We are out of time. This is so cool. I love what you were doing. And I think it's so cool that a physics major is now doing all this epigenetic and genetic research. That's very cool. So we have a 10% discount on ProsperK9 products if you use the code Dr. Judy. And I believe your website is prosperk9.com.
That's correct, yeah.
Yes. So, and that's K9. It'll be in the show notes. Everybody check it out. I think it's really cool. It's an easy test to do from home. You don't have to go anywhere. You order the test in the mail, get your cheek swab, put it back in the mail. How long does it usually take to get the results?
Usually 4 to 6 weeks.
Very cool. All right. Great information. I think I'm going to send some in on some of my kids because stuff I'd like to know. Thank you very much for your time today. And thank you for the great work that you're doing for our pets.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to another great Naturally Healthy Pets episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for some helpful links. And if you enjoy the show, please be sure to follow and listen for free on your favorite podcast app. We value your feedback and would love to hear from you on how we're doing. Visit drjudymorgan.com for healthy product recommendations, comprehensive courses, upcoming events, and other fantastic resources. Until next time, keep giving your pet the vibrant life they deserve.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. It is no substitute for professional care by a veterinarian, licensed nutritionist, or other qualified professional. You're encouraged to do your own research and should not rely on this information as professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Dr. Judy and her guests express their own views, experience, and conclusions. Dr. Judy Morgan's Naturally Healthy Pets neither endorses or opposes any particular view discussed here.